I tried to convince myself it was nothing more than a passing glance, the accidental meeting of eyes in the quiet intimacy of a home still waking up. But when I walked past him that morning, wearing something I probably shouldn't have, his gaze didn't just drift, it followed. It was slow, deliberate, heavy with an intensity that wasn't just curiosity. It felt like a physical touch, a silent challenge hanging in the air between us. For the first time in years, I found myself standing on a precipice, unsure if I wanted to retreat to safety or step closer to the edge. It was a Sunday, the kind of lazy, sun-drenched morning I used to cherish. The house was still, save for the distant, rhythmic chirping of birds and the soft settling of old floorboards. I was savoring the rare stillness, a luxury that felt increasingly fragile. Liam had been staying with me for a few weeks now, filling the void my late husband, Arthur, had left behind in ways I hadn't anticipated. I thought his stay would be a brief interlude, a temporary landing pad while he figured out his next move after finishing his master's degree. But even in that short time, his presence had altered the very atmosphere of the house. He brought a vibrancy back into the rooms that had grown silent and gray, and, much to my confusion, he brought something dormant back to life within me. That particular morning, I hadn't given a second thought to what I was wearing, a silk robe Arthur had bought me years ago for an anniversary I could barely remember. It was the color of champagne, clinging to my skin in soft fluid waves. It wasn't revealing, not in the scandalous sense, but it was far more intimate than the oversized sweaters and leggings I usually wore around the house. I wasn't expecting to see Liam at that hour. I assumed he, like most young men his age, would be sleeping off the week. But as I walked out of my bedroom, a steaming cup of Earl Grey in hand, there he was. He was standing at the end of the hallway, leaning casually against the wall, barefoot, a ceramic mug in one hand. The faint, polite smile on his lips froze the moment I stepped into view. His gaze didn't dart away politely. Instead, it drifted over me, traveling from the hem of the robe up to my eyes, lingering just a second too long to be innocent. "Morning," he said. His voice was casual, almost too casual, but his eyes gave him away. They were dark, dilated, focused entirely on me. "Good morning," I replied quickly, clutching my tea like a shield, my knuckles white against the ceramic. I moved past him, my pace brisk, feeling the heat rise in my cheeks. I could feel his gaze on my back, a tangible weight that followed me until I escaped into the sanctuary of the kitchen. My heart was hammering against my ribs in a rhythm I couldn't explain, my body hyper-aware of the encounter. It was nothing, I told myself again, leaning against the cold granite counter. Just a look. But that look stayed with me all day, replaying in my mind like a scene from a movie I couldn't turn off. Liam had always been polite, reserved even. He was nothing like Arthur. Arthur had been brash, charming, the kind of man who could command a room with a booming laugh and a firm handshake. Liam was more thoughtful, introspective. He was the kind of person who listened before he spoke, who observed the world with a quiet intensity. When Arthur and I first married, Liam was just a boy, Arthur's nephew, visiting during summer breaks. By the time he left for college, we'd settled into a comfortable, distant familiarity. But the man who returned to my house after Arthur's death wasn't the same boy who had left. Liam had grown into himself. He was confident now, self-assured in a way that wasn't arrogant but grounded. There was something about him that unsettled me in a way I hadn't anticipated. It wasn't just his looks, though I'd be lying if I said I hadn't noticed. The broad shoulders that filled out his t-shirts, the sharp, defined line of his jaw, the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled. It was impossible to ignore. But it was more than physical. It was the way he fit into the house, his presence quiet but undeniable. It was the way he made me feel seen in a way I hadn't felt in years. And now, with that lingering look from the hallway replaying in my mind, I felt a shift. The ground beneath me, which I had worked so hard to stabilize after Arthur's passing, felt suddenly unsteady. I tried to shake it off as the day went on, throwing myself into tasks I didn't really need to do. I deep cleaned the kitchen, scrubbing grout until my fingers ached. I reorganized the pantry, lining up cans with military precision. I even spent an hour in the garden under the midday sun, pulling weeds with a vengeance. But no matter how hard I worked, no matter how much I tried to exhaust myself physically, I couldn't stop thinking about Liam. That evening, we sat down for dinner together, a routine we'd fallen into since he moved in. The conversation was light, easy, skirting the surface of safe topics like the weather and local news. But I couldn't help noticing the way his eyes lingered on me when I spoke, watching my lips form words as if he were trying to memorize them. "You've been busy today," he said, his tone casual as he leaned back in his chair, swirling the water in his glass. I shrugged, keeping my gaze fixed firmly on my plate of roasted chicken. "Just trying to stay productive." His lips quirked into a small, knowing smile. "You always have to keep yourself busy, don't you? Afraid of what might happen if you stop?" The comment caught me off guard. I looked up, meeting his gaze across the table. "What do you mean?" "Nothing," he said quickly, but his expression softened. "It's just, you deserve to take a break sometimes, Eleanor. You carry the weight of this whole house on your shoulders." The way he said my name, so sincere and gentle, left me momentarily speechless. I forced a smile, changing the subject quickly to something mundane about the garden, but his words lingered long after dinner was over. That night, as I lay in bed, the darkness of the room pressing in around me, I couldn't stop thinking about the way Liam had looked at me in the hallway that morning, the intensity of his gaze, the way it had made me feel both vulnerable and alive at the same time. It was a feeling I hadn't expected, one I wasn't sure I wanted, but it was undeniable. And no amount of rationalizing or freezing him out could make it go away. The days that followed were a careful dance, a choreography of avoidance and attraction, where I wasn't sure who was leading. I told myself to keep my distance, to maintain the boundaries that had always been there, the walls of propriety and family ties, but Liam's presence was magnetic. No matter how hard I tried to stay away, I found myself drawn to him in ways I couldn't explain or justify. It started with small things. He began joining me in the garden, offering to help pull weeds or trim back the hedges that had grown wild since Arthur passed. At first I thought it was just politeness, a way for him to pass the time or pay his rent and labor. But then there were moments that lingered, interactions that felt like they carried a weight far heavier than simple courtesy. One afternoon, the sun beating down on our backs, I was kneeling in the dirt, tugging at a stubborn root that refused to yield. Liam crouched beside me, his shadow falling over my hands. "Here," he said softly, "let me." His hands were warmer than I expected as they brushed against mine, taking hold of the weed. I let go, watching as his strong hands worked the root free from the soil with an ease I envied. When he looked up at me, wiping a smudge of dirt from his forehead, there was a faint smile on his lips, and I felt a strange flutter in my chest, a quickening of my pulse. "You make it look easy," I said, trying to keep my tone light, breathless from the heat. "It's all about the angle," he replied, his smile widening. "You have to approach it from the right side." For a moment, we just looked at each other, the sunlight casting golden highlights in his hair, the smell of turned earth and blooming jasmine around us. The silence stretched, filled with the buzzing of bees and the thumping of my own heart. I cleared my throat, breaking the spell. "Thanks," I murmured, turning back to the garden bed. But I could feel his gaze on me, burning into my skin, and it made my hand tremble as I reached for the trowel. That evening, after dinner, we sat together in the living room. The storm outside had settled into a steady rhythm, the rain tapping a hypnotic beat against the window pane. Liam was stretched out on the couch, looking impossibly long and relaxed, flipping idly through a book. I sat in the armchair, curled up with a cup of tea, trying to focus on my own reading but failing miserably. "I don't know how you stay so calm," he said suddenly, his voice cutting through the quiet. I looked up, surprised, marking my page with a finger. "What do you mean?" He closed the book, setting it on his chest, his gaze meeting mine directly. "This house, it's so quiet. Do you ever get Overwhelmed? I hesitated, my fingers tightening around the warm mug. Sometimes, I admitted, but I'm used to it. Silence becomes a companion after a while. Liam nodded, leaning forward slightly, the book sliding to his lap. I don't think I could do it. I need noise, movement, something to keep my mind busy. I smiled faintly. That's why you're always fixing things, isn't it? The cabinet, the garage door. He chuckled, a low sound in his throat. Maybe, or maybe I just like fixing things that are broken. There was a pause then, a silence that felt heavy with unspoken words, with meanings layered beneath the surface. I didn't mean to bring it up, he said finally, his tone softer, almost apologetic. I don't know. I feel like you deserve more than this. The sincerity in his voice took me off guard. I stared at him, unsure how to respond. More than what? This house? This, he said, gesturing vaguely around the room, encompassing the silence, the solitude, maybe even my life. This quiet, this loneliness, you deserve to feel alive, Eleanor. The words hit me like a jolt, a physical shock to the system. For a moment I couldn't breathe. Alive. It was a word I hadn't applied to myself in a very long time. I'm fine, Liam, I said quickly, setting my tea down with a clatter and standing up. Panic fluttered in my chest. You don't need to worry about me. But as I walked past him toward the safety of the hallway, I could feel his eyes on me, steady and unflinching, seeing right through the walls I had built. The next day I found Liam in the garage, sorting through a pile of old tools that had belonged to Arthur. The smell of oil and sawdust hung in the air, a scent that was inextricably linked to my late husband. Liam looked up when I stepped inside, his expression softening instantly. Need something? He asked, wiping his greasy hands on a rag. No, I said, hesitating in the doorway, hugging my cardigan around myself. I just wanted to see what you were up to. He smiled, setting down a wrench. Just trying to make sense of all this. Your husband kept everything. I stepped closer, my eyes scanning the shelves lined with jars of nails and screws, half-empty cans of paint, and tools that hadn't been touched in years. Arthur always said you never know when you might need something, I said softly, a memory surfacing. Liam laughed, a gentle sound. Sounds like him. For a moment we stood in silence, the weight of Arthur's absence settling over us like dust. Then Liam turned to me, his gaze steady and searching. Do you miss him? The question caught me off guard, direct and piercing. I felt a lump rise in my throat. Every day, I admitted. But it changes. It becomes less sharp, more dull, like a bruise that's healing. Liam nodded, his expression unreadable, thoughtful. I do too. He was a good man. I looked at him, surprised by the vulnerability in his voice. You don't talk about him much. He shrugged, his eyes dropping to the concrete floor. It's hard. He wasn't around a lot when I was growing up, but he tried, in his own way. He loved you, I said quietly. Liam looked up, his eyes meeting mine, dark and intense. I know, he said, and I think he'd want you to be happy, Eleanor. The words hung in the air between us, heavy and unspoken, carrying a meaning we both understood but were afraid to voice. I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded, my chest tight with emotions I couldn't name. Grief, longing, and a terrifying spark of hope. That evening, as I stood in the kitchen washing dishes, the warm water soothing my hands, I felt Liam's presence before I heard him. The air shifted, charged with electricity. He stepped into the room, leaning against the counter as he watched me, arms crossed. You don't have to do all that, he said, his voice low, intimate. I don't mind, I replied, scrubbing a plate harder than necessary, not looking at him. It gives me something to do. There was a pause, the kind that made the air between us feel thick, suffocating. Eleanor, he said softly. The way he said my name made me stop. It wasn't Aunt Eleanor. It wasn't Mrs. Vance. It was just Eleanor, spoken with a familiarity that felt illicit. I turned to him, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. What? He hesitated, his gaze meeting mine, stripping away the pretense. You don't always have to do it alone. But now, with Liam here, that solitary life felt harder to maintain. The cracks were showing. He was in the house more than usual that week, working on small projects he'd taken upon himself, fixing a broken cabinet door, organizing the tools in the garage, painting the trim on the back porch. His presence was steady, grounding, and yet it left me feeling unmoored. One night, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the house fell into its usual stillness, I found myself wandering into the living room. Liam was there, sprawled across the couch, his long legs stretched out and a book resting on his chest. The soft glow of the lamp cast shadows across his face, highlighting the sharp angles of his cheekbones. For a moment, I just stood there watching him, drinking in the sight of him. "Can't sleep?" he asked, his voice low and quiet, without opening his eyes. I shook my head, stepping further into the room, the floorboards creaking softly. "Not really." He sat up, placing the book on the coffee table, and patted the cushion beside him, though I chose the armchair across from him instead. "Want to sit?" I hesitated for only a second before sinking into the armchair. The silence between us was heavy, charged, waiting for someone to strike a match. "I was thinking about Arthur today," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. Liam leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees, giving me his full attention. "What about him?" "Just how he used to fill this house, his laugh, his footsteps. It feels so quiet without him. Sometimes the silence is so loud it hurts." Liam's gaze was steady, his eyes filled with something I couldn't quite name: compassion, understanding, and something hotter. "It doesn't feel quiet to me," he said softly. I looked at him, my breath catching in my throat. "What do you mean?" "I mean," he said, his voice dropping an octave, "that when you're in the room it feels full. You fill it, Eleanor, even when you're silent." There was something in his tone, something in the way he looked at me, that made the air between us sizzle. I opened my mouth to say something, anything to diffuse the tension, but the words wouldn't come. Then he stood, crossing the small distance between us to kneel in front of my chair. My heart leaped into my throat. He was so close I could smell the scent of rain and soap on his skin. His hand reached for mine, his touch warm and steady, sending a jolt through me. "Eleanor," he whispered, a quiet plea on his lips. "Liam," I whispered back, my voice trembling. He looked at me like he was trying to memorize my face, his thumb brushing over the back of my hand, tracing the veins. "Tell me I'm not imagining this," he said, his voice raw. "Tell me you feel it too." I couldn't lie. I couldn't say it wasn't true. I was tired of lying to myself. "I don't know what to do," I admitted, my voice breaking. "Neither do I," he said. "But I can't stop thinking about you, about us." The word "us" sent a shiver through me. Before I could stop myself, my free hand reached up to touch his face, tracing the line of his jaw. His eyes fluttered shut for a moment, leaning into my touch, and when they opened again, they were filled with so much longing it made my chest ache. "We can't," I started, the protest weak even to my own ears. "Why not?" he asked, his voice quiet but firm. "Because it's wrong, because it's complicated, because it could ruin everything. But none of those reasons feel strong enough right now, do they?" He was right. None of those reasons felt strong enough to make me pull away. The next day I did everything I could to avoid him. I threw myself into cleaning rooms that didn't need cleaning, reorganizing the pantry for the 3rd time that month. I was running, hiding, trying to put the genie back in the bottle. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the memory of his touch, the way he looked at me like I was the only thing that mattered in the world. By mid-afternoon, the tension was unbearable. I found myself in the study, rearranging books on the shelves in a desperate attempt to keep my hands busy. "Do you need help with that?" Liam's voice came from the doorway, and I jumped, a book slipping from my hands. "No," I said quickly, bending to pick it up, my heart racing. "I've got it." He stepped into the room, his presence filling the space in a way that made it hard to breathe. "Eleanor, we need to talk." "I don't think that's a good idea," I said, turning back to the shelves, shoving the book into a gap where it didn't belong. "Why not?" he asked, his tone gentle but insistent. "Because," I trailed off, my hands trembling. "Because I'm scared." "You think I'm not?" he said, stepping closer. I turned to face him, my back pressing against the bookshelf. "Of course I'm scared," I said, my voice rising. This isn't supposed to happen. You're Arthur's nephew. I'm me." "But it did happen," he said, his voice calm and unyielding, "and ignoring it won't make it go away." I opened my mouth to argue, but the look in his eyes stopped me. He stepped closer, his hands bracing against the shelf on either side of me, trapping me in place but not touching me. It was a cage of his own making, and I didn't want to escape. "Eleanor," he said softly, his voice a whisper against my skin, "just tell me you don't feel the same and I'll walk away. I'll pack my bags tonight." I couldn't. I couldn't say it because it wasn't true. Instead, I reached up, my hand trembling as it rested against his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart. "I don't know what to do," I said, my voice breaking. "You don't have to do anything," he said, leaning in until our foreheads touched. "Just let me in." And I did. That evening the storm returned, rain pounding against the windows as thunder rolled in the distance. We sat on the couch together, the silence between us heavy but no longer uncomfortable. "Do you regret it?" he asked suddenly, his voice low. I looked at him, my chest tightening. "No," I said honestly. He nodded, his expression softening. "Neither do I." The tension between us was still there, but it felt different now, less like a burden and more like a promise. When he reached for my hand, I didn't pull away, and when he leaned in, pressing his lips to mine, I didn't stop him. The kiss was soft, hesitant at first, a question asked and answered. But the second his hand came up to cup my cheek, it deepened, full of longing and loneliness and years of denying myself the chance to feel alive. His hands were gentle but insistent, his touch igniting something in me I thought had died a long time ago. We didn't make it upstairs right away. The living room became a blur of soft whispers and quiet gasps, our movements slow and deliberate as we explored the boundaries we had both been too afraid to cross. By the time we moved to my bedroom, the rain outside had picked up again. Liam paused at the doorway, his gaze searching mine. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yes," I said, the word leaving my lips without hesitation. The next moments unfolded with a tenderness that took my breath away. Liam's touch was reverent, his movements deliberate, as if he was afraid I might vanish if he wasn't careful. I let myself surrender to him, to the way he made me feel seen and wanted in a way I hadn't in years. It wasn't just physical, it was emotional, a connection that felt impossibly deep, like we were both finding something we hadn't even realized we'd lost. When it was over, we lay tangled together beneath the sheets, the room bathed in the soft glow of the storm outside. Liam's arm was draped over my waist, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on my skin. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice breaking the quiet. I nodded, my throat tight with emotion. "Yes," I said softly. He pressed a kiss to my forehead, pulling me closer. "I meant what I said," he murmured. "I don't care how complicated it is. I just want to be with you." Tears stung my eyes, and I buried my face against his chest. "I don't know what happens next," I admitted, my voice trembling. "We'll figure it out," he said, his tone steady. "One step at a time." I woke before the sun, the house still shrouded in the soft gray light of dawn. For a moment I stayed still, listening to the rhythmic sound of Liam's breathing beside me. His arm was draped over my waist, his warmth a steady presence against the cool morning air. The events of the night before felt like a dream, fragile and surreal, but the weight of his hand on my hip told me it was real. My mind was a whirlwind of emotions, relief, guilt, fear, and something dangerous like joy. I slipped out of bed carefully, not wanting to wake him. Pulling on my robe, I padded to the kitchen, the floorboards creaking softly beneath my feet. The house felt different this morning, quieter in a way that wasn't unsettling but peaceful. I brewed a pot of coffee, the scent filling the air as I leaned against the counter, staring out the window. The garden glistened with dew. Last night I had let my guard down completely, and now I wasn't sure how to put it back up. Everything felt so precarious, like I was standing on the edge of something I couldn't fully see. "Morning," his voice startled me. and I turned to see him standing in the doorway. His hair was messy, his t-shirt slightly wrinkled, and there was a softness in his eyes that made my chest ache. "Good morning," I said, my voice quieter than I intended. He walked over to the counter, pouring himself a cup of coffee before leaning against the opposite side of the kitchen island. For a moment, we just stood there, the silence between us filled with everything we hadn't said. "Are you okay?" he asked finally, his tone careful. I nodded, though I wasn't sure if it was the truth. "Are you?" He smiled faintly, setting his mug down. "I am." The simplicity of his words made my throat tighten. I looked down at the counter, my fingers tracing the edge of the mug in my hands. "I don't know what happens now," I admitted. "Neither do I," he said, his voice steady. "But I don't regret it, at least not for a second." I looked up at him, his words sinking into my chest like a balm. "I don't regret it either," I said softly. The relief in his expression was palpable. He stepped around the island, closing the distance between us. His hand found mine, his fingers intertwining with mine as he squeezed it gently. "We'll figure it out," he said, his voice calm and sure. I nodded, holding onto his hand like it was the only thing keeping me steady. Later that morning, I sat on the porch with my second cup of coffee, the sunlight warming my skin as I watched Liam in the garden. He was pulling weeds, his movements deliberate as he worked to tame the wild overgrowth. The sight of him there, so natural and at ease, brought a small smile to my lips. The guilt wasn't gone. It lingered at the edges of my mind, a quiet reminder of the lines we'd crossed. But alongside it was something else, something I hadn't felt in years: hope. The path ahead of us was uncertain, filled with questions I didn't have the answers to. But for the first time, I wasn't afraid to face it. As I sat there, the sound of birds in the distance and the gentle hum of the world waking up, I let myself believe that maybe, just maybe, it was okay to feel alive again.